Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm joined by Nicky Drayden, author of Escaping Exodus and its new sequel, Symbiosis. This sci-fi duology explores a human civilization built entirely into colossal spacefaring beasts. The impetuous young Seska Cayley is a child of privilege and heir to the matriarchal throne of her people. As their recently relocated colony carves out a new city from the guts of their living host, Seska teeters between duty and scandal, engaging in romance with a girl from a lower caste. Sturdy beastworker Adala would spend her days laboring in the very heart of the beast, a dangerous and important job. But she's also Seska's best friend, and the young women's burgeoning romance threatens both their social standings and their lives in the strict and cruel hierarchy of their society. When their ill-advised adventures uncover alarming secrets about the nature of their home, Seska and Adala find themselves caught up in political machinations, family double-crosses, and lower caste uprisings. Can their love survive revolution and their own selfish choices? And how will their revelations reshape their world? Escaping Exodus is wildly imaginative space opera and is available now. The sequel, Escaping Exodus Symbiosis, arrives on February 23rd from Harper Voyager. And Nicky, welcome to Fictitious.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So you've been on my radar for a while. You have a reputation for writing some strikingly imaginative, strikingly different science fiction that also challenges a lot of things like gender roles and social barriers. There's a lot of thematic material that you cover in your books, whether it was in Temper or in these novels. It could be easily lost considering just the enormity of the world that you've created in this series and how different it is, but you're covering a lot of ground with this. And it was a difficult book to sum up as far as trying to give a kind of tagline for it, because the idea of an overarching romance sounds trite compared to just the sheer level of social upheaval and the big things that are happening in these novels. And I really only summed up part of the first book because to talk any more about the second one gives away a lot from the first one, and I don't want to spoil things for people. So getting started here, I think the best thing to do is to kind of let you describe these novels in your own words, and then I want to really dig into like the world building because it's crazy and imaginative and wild. I think I've used those words too often. It's big and challenging and kind of body horror-ish and very different from, I think, a lot of stuff other people have encountered. But yeah, how would you describe these novels? What's your elevator pitch for them?
I would call it like an Afrofuturistic love story that's set inside of the belly of a giant space-breathing beast that's the size of a small moon. And I definitely have a lot of environmentalism themes in there, a lot of class issues and clashing, and lots of tentacles everywhere also. And yeah, I have a hard time containing my thoughts, and they all kind of just end up in the novel. Maybe not so easy to summarize, but it definitely makes for an interesting read.
Yeah, there's so many details to dive into here as far as how the world works, how the social caste works, how these things are colonized. I mean, there's just a lot to think about from the back end of just the writing craft, let alone a lot of thematic material to cover. Let's talk a little bit about theme as far as, like you mentioned, there's definitely big environmentalist themes that I think become apparent maybe kind of a third of the way through the first novel. I think from the outside, it's kind of obvious, or should be obvious to a reader, that the idea of building an entire civilization inside of an unwilling larger creature comes with a lot of issues. But we also, we live in a meat-eating society. We live in a world that's been created by colonization, which is, done massive amounts of environmental damage and damage to indigenous peoples, and it generally doesn't care too much about what it hurts in the way in creating what it thinks it needs. So you have a lot of that kind of summed up in here. When you were first starting to work on the first novel in this duology, how much of that was on your mind to begin with that you were thinking that you were going to delve into, and how much of it developed on the page that you discover as you went along?
For me, it was fairly well formed. I kind of had this vision of this overarching story that takes place over several years, kind of like this love story between these two women, and they're placed on this beast that they really don't see a problem with the environmental impact. It's become such a part of the core fabric of their society, that they colonize these beasts like, every decade or two. And it's just like very cyclical in nature, but they don't see any like problem with it. And they don't recognize the beast for being a living sentient thing. And they just kind of tune out anything that doesn't support their own worldviews. And they do it so easily as we do. So it's just really easy to ignore what's literally going on all around you when you can just focus on whatever else you want in your life. So that was kind of one of the core concepts that I really wanted to delve into. And it is very much a body horror type setting, but I call it personally like body horror, but make it homey, because to them it's just like totally normal that we're living inside these beasts. It's totally normal that you get this awesome job like working inside the heart. It's like one of the most prestigious jobs you can have as a beast worker. Like, I like being able to kind of gross out the reader, but like the actual characters, it's just their ordinary day life. Like, you might go to the park and like there are like these swamps, and like creatures that live in the swamps might try to like eat you if you venture too far into them. And so it's just like a normal part of nature. And I really love that about it.
There's something that you mentioned in there that I definitely connect to, which is this idea of our two main characters are fairly naive to a lot of the problems of the world that they're living in. Whenever I prep for these interviews, I go and I look at reviews. I try to see what other people are reacting to, or what differences in experience they've had with it. And one of the things I saw people react to was that, like, how are these characters blind to these things? And I'm like, easily. Like, we are conditioned by our environment all the time. And like you said, things that from the outside may seem very obvious can be a complete surprise to somebody who's on the inside. I mean, my example for it is, I could start some nonsense with people about this by even saying this, but I'm super anti Santa Claus and the whole idea of Santa delivering presents. And my takeaway from it is that, because I think it is, one, lying to children, but two, that it teaches kids that come from poor families that they don't deserve to get things from Santa. And there's a lot of classism like in that story and the way that it's rolled out to people. But if you grew up with just the happy fantasy in your mind, or just what was pitched to you as a kid, you just think of it as this magical thing that we experience as children. Versus if you grew up poor and had that feeling like, well, I mean, I must not deserve it because Santa didn't bring me anything. There's a whole load of societal issues that are wrapped up in that. That's a real big divergence from what we're talking about here. But it is, how I think about, like, we can sometimes only see what we've been allowed to see, or at the very least, what we're conditioned to see. And I think that this is in part a tale of two people seeing a much bigger world around them in ways that they didn't see it before. And I think that there's an interesting turning point about a third of the way through the novel where Seska makes a discovery about something about this, living vessel that they're in, about the sentience and nature of it, and the way the way her people are reacting to it, that I think sets up a lot of changes for later on, but doesn't necessarily spur her into action immediately. It takes a lot more poking to get there. And I think that's realistic. I think sometimes we have in stories where there's just like the one great epiphany that changes everything. And I think it often takes a lot more for people to shift. So that makes a lot of sense to me in this story. You mentioned the body horror aspect of it here. I describe this as space opera. It is, to use a word I discovered online that I like a lot, it's squelchy. There is a lot of, there's a lot of viscera. There's a lot of ichor. There's a lot of, I mean, they're literally wandering around in big squishy body parts. If you made a movie of this, it would look like a hentai nightmare, right? Like, it would be a weird world full of sphincters and tentacles and gore and strangeness. For you, when you talk about this book to people, when you were pitching it to your editors and your agents and looking for audience, how do you approach them about that? When you're like, it's a really squishy body horror, how do you pitch that? What do you think the audience is that really gets into that kind of thing?
Definitely, if you're really squeamish, it might be difficult. But I mean, it's kind of a love story, story of revolution, a story of cultures clashing. If you like world building, just maybe not pay attention so much to the blood and gooey tentacly things that are going on. But like, there's so much more to it than that. And I think it's just like kind of the backdrop, and it's very like central and important to the story, but also there's like so much other things that are going on. And just like getting to see these characters kind of dive into and out of each other's lives. There's like they're in a matriarchy. One of the things I wanted to do was to write a matriarchy that was very awful. Like probably the most feminist person in the book is a guy who's trying to make a living in this world where men are traditionally stay at home and aren't allowed to work outside the home. And so like seeing the story through his eyes and seeing how kind of frustrated he gets with Seska, who just will not, she's kind of like getting okay to deal with kind of like class issues and see kind of that level of like injustice, but like gender injustice is just like completely like this thing that she can't even like grasp at all. And so, and to see different people's shortcomings as characters and as they all try to like understand each other's worlds was a lot of fun to write.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm going to circle back around to that because I really do want to talk about the matriarchal society, the history of them, how they came to be that way, all those things. I think it will be good to build this world a little bit more first before we get to that, because it is so striking, it is so different. It's set in space, but really we're inside these massive beasts. Some people have referred to them as space whales, but there are tentacles, so it feels a bit more like cephalopodish to me. Yeah. I mean, I feel like maybe there's an ambiguous middle ground there for precise, what that is. I mean, but how do you describe that world? How do you explain what this thing is that they're in, or as much as you can without giving away too much, and just how they live inside of it? How do you make a world inside of a giant living animal?
I can talk a little about the history of that. But yeah, it's kind of like, I always say analogous to like a giant space squid kind of tentacly thing that's very smart. So society, in the history of this book, society left Earth like probably about 1,000 years ago, and with the intention to colonize other planets. Didn't go so well, and they ended up finding these like a giant herd of space beasts, and at first they were like, oh great, like something we can use for resources, and so they would go in and mine and take whatever resources they want from the beast. And then eventually they were like, well, might be just easier if we just like terraform this beast to fit our needs and like live inside of it, and we'll use up the resources. And once that's done, there's this whole herd, we can just go catch the next one and repeat that cycle on and on. And so that's kind of their plan, to just use up resources, which is very thematic of the life that we lead. When there are infinite resources, supposedly infinite resources at your disposal, you might not see that it's such a problem. Forget that, that it's a living thing, but like you're not worried about scarcity. There's always another beast to colonize. And they go through great pains to make sure like most of the people aren't even aware that they have this like nomadic nature to their society, because they all go into stasis during the process of like deconstructing everything and moving it to the next piece. So everyone's kind of like not even aware of all the construction that needs to be done. They need to like take bone from the beast and use that as like some of their building material to make the homes. There's ways that they like boil the ichor to make oxygen and all these different things to like just make it habitable. And it's just like slowly destroys the beast in the process. When you think about it, it's something that's very sad. So I hope that's something that readers take away from it and are able to maybe open their eyes to what we are doing here on this planet, and just draw some parallels to that. So hopefully I don't know. I like to explore things that are on my mind, definitely through science fiction. And that's something I do there.
Well, there's a lot to explore in this world, and certainly just entering the novels. I mean, kind of the first thing is to get used to the setting, which in a lot of ways I thought it reminded me of like a biopunk Snowpiercer in a way. In the sense that you have a whole society bottled up inside of one specific capsule that their whole world is built up inside of. But then you do have elaborate caste systems that are built in this, because humans cannot let go of hierarchies and cannot let go of having a lower class and a higher class. There's a fascinating idea to me that when they make the jump between these creatures and these sort of bioships, like you said, like the contour class, the higher class basically just sleeps through the big change. Like they just come to, and the world is reconstructed almost exactly the way it was in the previous animal. So they don't feel much difference. They just wake up out of the ship and go about their normal everyday lives. Their homes are rebuilt to like an exacting specification so that it feels exactly the same. But the worker class doesn't get that. The worker class has to come in and build everything from scratch and lives in essentially shanty towns inside of this enormous beast. And it is this matriarchal system. You kind of detail a little bit in the books where that change happens, how it shifts into being the way it is. It's also, these are very plural families. The family structures are made up of, I may get the counts wrong, where it's like 3 men, 6 women, and 1 child, like into each one of the families. And they're very specific about not allowing siblings, which is a major plot point in the story as well. There's a lot going on with these family structures. So I want to know like how you can kind of explain the matriarchal society, what the roles are in the society, how that affects Seska and Adala in this too. And then basically we can kind of get into the weeds of how you constructed that, kept track of all of that, made that work on the back end as a writer.
Definitely. I did have fun with the different family structures. That kind of came out of kind of like a necessity in living in a kind of a scarce time in the beginning of their journey and trying to figure out how to live upon these beasts when everything was very much rationed. We have one of the classes is considered accountancy guards, and they go around and making sure like no one's taking more than their fair share. And so as time went along, the family units were like who was allowed to have children kind of changed over time. And so they kind of put the family unit based around this child. You kind of get more and more people in the family taking care of this one child. So we have now in the present or the future, we have 3 sets of parents that are all kind of given specific roles in raising the child. So you have the heart parents who are kind of in charge of everything that's heart related, like love and, raising them to be a caring child and like all these kind of emotional things. You have the head parents who are in charge of like schooling and making sure, making right decisions. And the will parents are kind of like the moral compass, giving them good values. And so like we have these sets of parents that are raising this one child because that's all they get. There's just like how there just can't be a lot of children in this society right now. But I enjoyed like putting that together. And it's actually the heart wives, there are the only ones that don't have a husband. And they used to historically, but kind of you see that men are kind of getting squeezed out slowly of the society. And so, and so it's just interesting to see like all the different dynamics that causes when you start to have a large size of a family and everyone has kind of conflicting views on different things. And for Seska, like she has to have the sex talk, like, I don't know how many times is that, like 8 times or something, 9 times.
9.
So imagine like as awkward as that is, you have to have it from each parent. And each one brings something different because like your head parents will be like, this is who you need to marry for, to increase the status of our family. The heart parents are, this is how you be a good lover or whatever. And then the will parents, making sure you're just not like lusting after everybody or whatever. And so like each of them like brings this. And so poor Seska has to have this talk, and everyone does, but has this talk like several times, and it's just like embarrassing on every account. And her last one, she hasn't gotten it from her head mother, who is the matriarch of their society. So that's the last one she gets. And I don't know, I think it's just fun playing around with the different ways that families work when there's a lot of people.
This is something I've seen a little bit more in sci-fi recently, this exploration of like plural families, more like community families. I mean, it's been in sci-fi for decades, but I think that it's becoming something that like people are talking about more frequently as the nature of our gender boundaries and how pairings and everything work in real life change. As you're assembling this in this story, I mean, this is a very complex society because society is complex by its nature.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a well-developed society that has been living in this particular way for a long time. From a pure nuts and bolts standpoint, what did your notes look like on that? How did you track all? Do you have kind of like maps out where you're like, okay, here's how the family lines work, here's how the different caste system, here's how individual families break down, all that stuff? Because it's something. One, I mean, I think developing all that or giving all that information to the reader is difficult. Keeping track of it so you know all of it and you can keep it consistent has got to be its own kind of challenge. So, what did that look like for you from a purely constructive standpoint?
Yeah, I do keep a lot of notes and try to keep who's who straight, giving everyone names and just kind of try to make it as real as I can in my own mind, because I think it just kind of helps when it gets onto the page. And what really helps, like if you're having these big family dinners, it helps to like draw the table and like right where people are sitting, because otherwise people can kind of be talking to somebody who's like on the other side and they might not necessarily be able to hear them. So it's like logistically you have to keep track of things, and also like who's gonna give this talk particular way to Seska for her sex talks or whatever, or who's in charge of her schooling, and then like what names do they go by. So like if you have 9 parents, you're going to probably call each of them something different, and so you have to like keep track of who gets called what, and also not wanting to overwhelm the reader, so knowing when to like pull back and just kind of focus on like a few of them. But it's nice and just to see how those relationships play out in different casts also, because we get a little bit of Adala's family, and her family is a little bit different. It's still the same basic structure. And she has her biological father died. And then she has what's called a tin uncle, which is kind of like an adopted father, but like he was kind of adopted into the family, I guess, by the mothers that were widows. And so he figures into the story pretty prominently, so we get to see that, and also seeing how like the different mothers like celebrate, like Seska gets her period like early on in the book, and like to see how the Heart mothers celebrate this in Adala's culture versus how it's celebrated in Seska's culture. Is fun to see how those family dynamics kind of change based on the class you're in.
There's a thing that I really liked in exploring the cast that Adala's character is in, which is that when kind of going through their, I guess you'd call them neighborhoods, a lot of their, at this point in time when the story starts in the first novel, a lot of it's not built yet. They don't really have walls. They don't really have privacy. But what they've created culturally is a sort of mental privacy, a way of walking through these spaces and just kind of ignoring them, just being aware, oh, I can see people copulating. I can see a person on the toilet. I can see people just going about their business or having an argument. And you're conscious of them happening, but you just shut it down in your head. Adala knows to just not see those things. But Seska walking through is kind of gawking about, being like, just noticing or shining a light on it, essentially, when culturally what they've assembled is this ability to ignore things, to give privacy. And I thought that was a really fascinating idea and a way to kind of explore how people would change their behaviors or just change their mind about how things work like that. Something I think it's also kind of worth noting is that there's a lot about this social system that to me feels very cruel. They dispense a lot of harsh, swift punishment. Some of it is in the nature of lashings, which Adala receives at one point, and almost with a certain sense of pride. There's basically this punishment that involves hanging people by their thumbs, which is something that has affected one of those characters you were just talking about a minute ago. But a really striking moment for me in the novel is there's a moment amongst the Heart workers where a young recruit fails at something. And she fails at something that's very important, but also could seem very trivial in a lot of ways. And after it happens, the workers around her hold her down and cut off her braids. And that is a moment of an erasure of identity, where they strip her basically of her family line. Her mother is weeping next to her because it basically shows their family line stops. And it feels like such an enormous punishment for something that's a minor slip up. And this culture seems built on a lot of that. And clearly you've been talking about how like there's a lot wrong in this culture, a lot that needs to be addressed. When putting something like this together, you're showing this is the world they live in, but it's also inhabited with so much unfairness and injustice. How are you approaching those ideas? Is there any point where it felt like, oh my gosh, maybe this is too big, this is too rough? What point does the audience feel like, I don't know if I can spend time with these people because this is so difficult, versus finding your way to how this sets up a need for change?
That's a good question. I think there are definitely a lot of rough points in this book. And that was like it was a challenging scene to write, but I also really enjoyed how it came out, because it was a very visceral thing that happens. And like the stakes are very high. When you work in the heart, the stakes are extremely high. And so there's no room to mess up. And it is remarkably cruel. But I remember like right around when I was writing that, there was I think it was wrestling guy on a wrestling team who had like dreads or something. And they wouldn't let him wrestle because his cap wasn't fitting on right or some kind of like nonsense. And they like sat there, and he wanted to do his team solid and wrestle, not forfeit the game, and like cut off his hair. And it was just like such an angry making moment to see just all the layers of cruelty that came into that. And then his teammates cheering him on. And like this was something to be proud of, when it was just like unspeakably cruel thing. And so like a lot of those feelings kind of went into that, of stripping someone like of their identity, effectively ending their lineage, and like long line of lineage that they'd been proud of. And so like kind of tying those things together, and showing in the same scene, Adala is very generous with her time, and like very like loving towards these strangers and trying to save lives. And like within like half of a second later, like we're seeing this cruel act. So kind of like pairing like the best of someone's heart with the worst of someone's heart together. It's just, yeah, I like the scenes where like you go through a whole range of emotions in like a short period of time. So yeah.
Yeah, that particular sequence, which is and I want to talk about POV here because we do have two primary POV characters, and that is a sequence where we get to see Adala really moving to like her ambition, which is to work in the heart. And there's so many layers to that sequence, and how quickly we see her be genuinely great and talented at something, and at the same time be surrounded by a very casual response to people dying, and to people and the recognition that to have even gone and tried to do this job and to not be good at it is more or less perceived as worthy of death. There's a moment where one of her mothers who's with her basically says, when these people wash out, you're doing us a favor, because if you screw up down here, everyone could die. So you're aware huge stakes are in place, and so there's a reason why they don't tolerate failure. But at the same time, it feels so incredibly painful to see that exacted. It sets a tone for a lot of the other things that happen in the novel. And I think what's really interesting in that dual POV is Seska, this child of privilege and who is in line to be the heir, has a lot of selfishness, has a lot of impetuousness, and so much consequence to her choices, the way she treats people, the way she manipulates situations, how quick she will be to do things that are potentially exceptionally damaging to the other people in her lives, just because she's trying to figure out how to manage her own moment. And she is a walking disaster for the people around her in a lot of ways, versus Adala, who is far more empathetic, far more considerate of others, and is also just a more responsible human being in general. Thinking about those POVs, it should be noted that they're both first-person POVs, which I think is an interesting choice because, it lets us get right inside their heads. But I think as a writer, that gives you a new challenge, which is really differentiating their narrative voices. So I want to know first, what was your approach for that? Like, how did you approach making sure that the audience would have a very definitive feeling for which character they were inhabiting, depending on the chapter?
I think that is one of the things that came out of having two people of two different classes that are so different, is that they're in the same book, but they grew up in different worlds. They have different patterns of speaking. They have different like references when they compared things. And so that made it a little bit easier. And just to have there's like daddy's bells is like one of the things like the characters say. And so like there's just like little speech ticks giving them, I don't know, just a little insight to kind of the things that they value, and setting up their, like Adala's like superstitious, like there's a lot of like superstition that happens in their culture. And so like things that like Seska tries to understand, but she really doesn't. She just kind of like entertains Adala a lot of the time. But, you know, at the same time, they have their own superstitions and kind of just exploring the ways, like we kind of just like laugh at other people's things. And like when we have equally ridiculous things, like they have a wall of ancestors so that they pray to and like light candles for. And that's like Seska's, you know, way of honoring her, like the spirits that are important to her. If Adala like would dare like say something like the way she, you know, Seska treats Adala, then like there would probably be a problem and maybe she would understand a little bit better. But yeah, it's just finding ways to differentiate. And if they sounded different to me, I think I was doing okay. There are some chapters I would read and I like forget who it was, and I'm like, well, I need to go back and do a better job because like if I'm confused, like the reader's going to be confused. So
I noted there a minute ago that, you know, that there's a big difference between the personalities of these two characters. Editorially, what was kind of the feedback with them? Because I think Seska, especially throughout the novel, can be an unlikable character because she is difficult, she is young, she is headstrong, she often forgets to care about what other people need. She obviously cares for Adala, but that doesn't stop her from making a lot of selfish choices. When you're going through the editorial process, what's that feedback look like? You know, when they're like, okay, do we need to rein this in a little bit, or how do we fix that? What was that like for you?
Ooh, I don't remember like there being any issues. I think, you know, unlikable characters can be interesting. And I think, like, to be fair, like she's had a lot of things thrust on her and has been protected from them. Like she definitely is not the person for the job. And so I think in a lot of ways she's like trying to just cope the best she can. Because in this world, her mother is kind of known to be kind of a cruel, uncaring person. But like the one act of kindness she had that was kind of also act of selfishness was not to end the pregnancy with Seska's sister, because there's only one child allowed per family, and like two of the wives were pregnant at the same time, and it's just like whoever's born first, and Seska was born prematurely and shouldn't have been, and lived and shouldn't have. And so like she has a sister, and she's the only person that has a sister, who the sister is probably like the perfect candidate to be the next matriarch. And so there's just like this extra awkwardness of this sister who never gets a name. They call her sisterkin because she's not legitimate in any way. She has no rights to anything that Seska has, even though she's 10 times better at everything. There's just like, I don't know, I feel bad for Seska, and like she's just kind of in this impossible situation with not a lot of resources. Like people are always after her and trying to like break her down and steal back what they want from her, and she's just a target. And so I think she does the best she can. Like maybe not the most likable character, but I think people will understand why she makes the decisions she makes, or at least why she doesn't make better decisions.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think with Seska too, I mean, I think that one of the big drives of the story is kind of a redemption arc, is a character recognizing that she has made huge mistakes, and also maybe recognizing that she's not the best person for the job that in the beginning she so desperately wants, and is trying to figure out how best to situate herself. I think the Sisterkin character is a very interesting dilemma in this story, somebody who is the better choice for the role and denied that because of the way their social hierarchy is designed. I think when we read things like that in fiction, they feel bright and clear and wrong in ways that in our everyday lives, similar things might exist, but we just don't see them that way. And I think books like this illustrate some of that stuff for us, where it gives us a way to kind of look at real life and be like, no, we have a lot of that stuff in our lives too. Maybe the caste system in America isn't as clearly defined in the way that, you know, we might see it in a book like this, but it's there. It inhabits all of our lives, and for a lot of people it's real obvious, and for a lot of other people they're insulated from it, you know. So and you see Seska be insulated from it and have to recognize those truths, which is a big deal in the story. For Adala, having a relationship with Seska is dangerous in a lot of ways. It's dangerous for both of them, but for Adala being lower class in particular, it threatens a lot of things. She goes through a lot of changes and upheavals. A lot of the roles that she intended to inhabit get taken from her. She gets pushed into very different circumstances. She gets disgraced in a lot of ways. And I don't think I'm giving away anything too specific that will damage people's enjoyment of the story. But it really pushes her to be a part of some other social upheaval that's happening there. Without giving too much away, especially for where these things lead into the second novel and all that, what can you tell us about Adala's motivations and some of the changes that she goes through as a character?
Yes, let's see. That's tricky. Yeah, I don't know. Adala, yeah, she's just my heart. She does have a fall from grace and tries to scramble back up. But I think like even within the beast workers, like there's a very strict hierarchy, and then she's kind of was born at the top of it. And so it's kind of a similar thing that Seska experiences, just not to the same degree, when she is like kind of forced into a lower caste and actually like kind of makes the most of it. And she gets to see more of the world, be exposed to more of the world, and kind of be fueled by that to do something about it. And to see like there is power, like the system is trying to keep them down by keeping them busy and keeping them working and like struggling. But they do have a lot of power actually. And if they can get that together, and they might be able to make some changes. And so I liked working with her arc and giving her some space and for her to like make some hard decisions that kind of jeopardize her future, but like you put it all on the line and see what happens, or, be comfortable where you're at. And so like that's kind of where she ends up.
I think with these two characters, they do to a certain degree embody the trope of like friends to lovers. We know that that's coming for them from like the very start of the story. There's really no question that's there. Thinking about trope, and I know that can be a dirty word for some people. It's also something that we talk about a lot on the show because it's very much the building blocks of story. What were you cognizant of trope when it came to writing this story, or what things did you become aware of as you were constructing it, and what's kind of your own relationship to trope as a writer?
I think Friends to Lovers is like one of my favorites for sure. Just kind of exploring that, just like that tension, like just not knowing and seeing where their friendship goes. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's exciting for me. And friends to lovers, to friends, to enemies, to any kind of, like, I don't know. I really like, that's something I kind of explore in the second book. But just like the changing dynamics of relationships is really interesting. Power dynamics in relationships is always really interesting to me.
And then just into the real nuts and bolts of storytelling for you. You an outliner, a pantser, discovery writer, somewhere in between. What's that look like for you?
I used to be a total pantser when I started writing. Like I got started writing through National Novel Writing Month. I'm like, I'm just going to sit down. I don't even know what kind of idea I had. I just like started and did the stuff until the story was done. Like nowadays, I think out of necessity, I do outline just because like editors want to see an outline in the early stage. I don't feel like I am like constrained to it by any means. If I was writing something like, for me personally, I would probably do outline maybe a third of the book at a time, and then like keep outlining as I go. So like I don't know, I like the mystery of not knowing where a story is going, but it's also nice to have like fallback of kind of knowing it's going somewhere. So I'm kind of all over the place. It just depends on the project, and it's all good. However it gets you to the end is what's important.
I like that idea of like outlining maybe a third at a time, because I think sometimes the danger for a lot of people is you outline an entire novel and then you get a third or halfway through and you just start discovering that your characters want to do something different than what your initial outline was. And to stay true to them, you have to adjust it. And really that just means going through and making changes. But if you're really kind of blocking out, know where you're going, I think is helpful. Although not, again, sometimes the mystery can be what's compelling about the writing for a lot of people. Having that sense of like, well, I know this structure to here, and then I can invent the next part because that'll inform it. I think that makes a lot of sense for sure. Do you have any kind of plotting system that you adhere to? I mean, as simple as doing a 3-act or just something more complicated?
I do like the React. I have like for like technical things, I do this thing called like a plot thickener. And it's kind of like something I do on the second draft. But I just basically in this Excel sheet, and I write down like all the chapters across like the top columns, and then like the themes I explore. It's like 5 to 8 themes or character relationships or like major plot points or whatever in the book. And then I go through each cell and rate like how strong that relationship is on a scale of 7. And I have it colored, like I'm a data nerd. So if you haven't noticed, but systems analyst by day. And so like I can go through and look at like each point for each chapter and see like if things are progressing. Is it like something that's growing? Is there a spot like where I forget about like these characters for like a long period of time, so I can go back in and like pad some stuff in there and fill that back in. It's like a chore for sure, but it's like just kind of a way to make sure things are balanced and make sure the intensity level is where I want it to be on a variety of things. And it's just very in a graphical kind of format.
Well, I like that idea of the plot thickener. I really appreciate that you mentioned being like a data analyst in your day job, because it's always interesting to me how, whether it's the outside job or just the outside interests and stuff and the aptitudes, how that affects how a writer approaches things. Like for me, I'm a very visual person. I'm a graphic designer. And so I kind of can't write a ton without at some point creating some sort of graphical representation of what I'm doing. Like it's almost like a pressure valve that needs to be released, or it helps you figure stuff out. You mentioned there like schemating a room so you know where people are sitting next to each other, because nothing's weirder in a novel than reading something where the spatial relations are all off. And I've read novels like that where clearly the authors lost track of where people were at, and there's somebody who is 2 rooms away, and then suddenly they're whispering in somebody's ear, and it doesn't make any sense. And you can always be like, oh, the editors didn't catch that one. So yeah, having those types of things, like you're talking about like the spreadsheet, and you were by far not the first person I've talked to that has spreadsheets to figure out those points. And I think that can be really helpful, especially when you're figuring out something as complicated as making chapters do a couple of different things, move the story, but also have those thematic elements. Beyond using like an Excel sheet, what do you actually write in? What is your tool of the trade?
I've been using Google Docs just because it's there. I don't know how I started on that, but usually the first draft goes in there, and then I move it to Word after like I have a draft. And nothing fancy.
Well, there's been a growing number of people who have talked about Google Docs. I have a weird relation. I really don't like Word, and I think that stems back to it being a clunky ass thing from the 90s that it still makes me aggravated to even open and look at it. But Google Docs has really become this easy way for people to write without a lot of extra junk in their way. You don't even have to think about saving. It's just, getting it done in the background, which I think is a really nice thing, and it definitely seems to be becoming more popular. So that's very cool. Well, like I said at the top, Escaping Exodus, I don't have the physical copy of the second book yet, but I'm going to stick this into the screen. You probably have one handy. Yeah.
I don't have one. I do have this. I got my spaz.
So we can kind of put them next to each other there. And all those graphics will have shown at the top, so people will see. I mean, these are beautiful covers, very, very colorful. Like you said, I mean, it reinforces the Afrofuturist nature of this. I didn't mention it somewhere in the story, but I mean, everybody in this world are people of color, and reflect like, on culture that is made up of those people. And the other novels and stuff show that there are other cultures of people living in some of these other beasts and stuff. But everything from the tattoos that they have on their faces and stuff, like this is a really fascinating group of people living in this world, in this really, really striking bit of world building. Writers listening to the show, if they're nerds for world building, I think this series is definitely something to check out, because there's just so much fascinating thinking. I think to a certain extent, I mean, this almost works as a fantasy in the same way. I think if people are genre purists, which they should not be because that's dumb, but if they are, you could read this as fantasy and it would still work, even though it is, a science fiction novel. But also from a story standpoint, thematically, there's so much ground. There's so much interesting stuff going on. There's a lot to chew on. The first one is out. The next one comes out on February 23rd, I believe. This episode will probably drop right before that. So hopefully, as people are exploring this, the book will be available. Either pre-order it or order it. Go get it wherever you buy your books. And Nicky, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.